So now we move to our first guest speaker, Dr. Marley Jarvis. She is Outreach and Education Specialist at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, iLabs, at the University of Washington. She works with early learning professionals, educators, parents, and policymakers to apply research findings to their work. And I learned that she started in this as a marine scientist studying plankton. And this is where she got started translating research for public audiences. And I think, Marley, you have a group here that agrees all of the brain science that needs to be translated to the broader public. And so we're really eager to hear from you. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I mean, it's really wonderful that you guys have been doing this for 10 years. And, you know, you kind of alluded to how challenging the last couple of years have been for children and families, and programs for sure. Education programs have really had their work cut out for them. So I think it's a really important time to kind of be taking stock and celebrating, and also looking forward to what you want to do, how you want to respond. And I just wanted to thank you all for the work that you do supporting children and families. It's really nice to come out of the lab space, come out of research land, and get to share a space with folks like yourselves who are really out there doing amazing things, supporting children and families. So thank you, first and foremost. As was mentioned, my name is Marley, and I'm with the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, which is a large research institute at the University of Washington in Seattle. I say large, there's probably about 80 or so folks there, mostly doing research on early childhood development and early brain development, kind of focusing on 0 to 5 years of age, and slowly getting older and older, not much on adults, but some on some of the teenage years and brain development as well, because there's fascinating stuff going on inside those brains of teenagers. But our primary field that we're well known for is language development and brain development in those first couple years of life. So that's largely what I'm talking about today, is this idea of building our brain. And so we'll kind of explore some of the science of early brain development from sort of a higher level. What you're seeing on the slide here, that's the Twitter handle for iLabs, our institute. So feel free to follow us, learn more of some of the many different research studies we have going on. Next slide, please. So some of you have probably seen some of this data before. This is not particularly new, but it's a great place for us to start. So what you're looking at is estimates of brain size by volume, if you're curious, or kind of weight, at different stages throughout your life. So when we're thinking about a newborn baby, they are born with their brains about 25% of the adult size. And they go from 25% to 70% of adult size just in that very first year, which is quite impressive when you're thinking about it. But you know, I want to acknowledge newborns have pretty large brains already out of the get-go. So some way to put that in perspective is think of how much you weigh. You don't have to share it. So just think in your head how much you weigh. And then if you divide that number by 4, and think what a newborn that weighed that, you know, that would be a hefty newborn. So thank goodness for birthing parents out there that is not the case. So the head is already a quite large proportion of a newborn's body. So 25% of the adult size at birth. But then you look, okay, to 70% by year 1, to 85% of adult size by the time they're 3. And then by the time they're going into kindergarten, so about 5 years, their brains are over 90% of the adult size. So this is often, you know, one of those statistics that I think gets thrown out there quite a bit, and it's quite impressive. But I did want to clarify, you know, it's not by the time that they're 5 years old, children's brains are 90% done. There's a lot of brain growth going on, but it certainly, if you've hung out with a 5-year-old, which it sounds like many of you have, you know that their learning is not quite done. But this is just an important illustration that there is a ton of brain growth and development, and a really important period in our life, especially in building this brain in the first 5 years. Next slide, please. And all of this is to say that we are growing our brains. So we have this massive construction project. Essentially, when we're born, our brains aren't done. So what I was just showing you is quite a bit how our brains are not done. It's working and working and working. We're growing and growing and growing. Next slide. And you may have also seen this statistic. So children's brains are estimated to make about 1 million new connections every second from birth to age 3. So it's another illustration. This is just an estimate. It's kind of hard to get really precise numbers, but it's a useful illustration of, oh my goodness, there is so much going on. So while, a toddler is kind of falling on their bum trying to walk or running around, there's just lightning going on in their head is sort of how I like to think of it. Next slide, please. So what those connections are is we're looking at a really simplified diagram of a bunch of neurons, or these brain cells. And the way your brain cells work is that they have these branches that form connections. And the connection is called a synapse. So it's just this little space between the branches of your brain cells. And they're able to pass messages back and forth there. So next slide, please. And so again, this is sort of simplified. Now you imagine each brain cell making connections with what's shown here, a couple other neurons, but in reality, okay, we've got 86 billion neurons about, and then each one is estimated to connect to about 7,000 other neurons. So this is this incredible, vast, complicated network in our brains. Some people think it's probably the most complicated network in the known universe. And all of these connections are really key. So when we're learning something new, we're building connections between neurons in our brain. So I like to think of this, it's kind of, when we're thinking about early learning or what it means to learn something. These brain connections, that's what learning looks like at kind of the cellular level in your brain, which I think is really fascinating. It's kind of helpful to think about why all of these brain connections that are forming in the first 5 years of life, why that's so important. It's the cellular aspect of learning. Next slide, please. And we form new connections, but they also can get stronger. So when you learn something new or you're having an experience, especially a particularly meaningful one, and we'll talk about that, what happens in your brain is either you form more of those branches, more of those connections, or kind of what's depicted in the dark blue here on the right, the ability for that message to happen between a connection gets stronger. So you've got multiple ways in the brain for these connections to get stronger. And they get stronger with experience. So that's something I want you to remember. So it's not just that our brains are making tons of connections in our earliest years. Some of these connections, a large number of them, are driven by the experiences that we have. Next slide, please. So in a very real way, this is why you hear things about how our earliest experiences are, shaping our brains or forming the foundational architecture, if you will, of our brains. And it's not in a kind of metaphorical sense, it's in a direct cellular level way that our experiences are shaping our brain. And I did want to point out that this doesn't mean it's set in stone. So we are not, forever victims of how our brain gets set up. It's kind of one of these remarkable things that we've learned in recent neuroscience is about the plasticity of our brains. So this ability for our brains to change at any age. But kind of just like building a house, it's sort of easier if you are getting that foundation before adding on to it. If you have to go and change the foundation later, that's a lot more expensive. So we can certainly change our brains and due to experiences throughout our lives. But these first 5-ish years, those early years, really have a huge impact on that cellular level of our brain and how the structure is. So importantly, it's not just any old experience, but our brains are particularly wired to make these kinds of connections from meaningful experiences with other people. Next slide, please. So I like to think of this as our social brains. And research really tells us that our brains kind of have this capacity and inclination for social connection from birth, really. Next slide. So for example, here's kind of a classic study, and they're looking at newborns, and newborns tend to turn and look to faces, particularly those that might be making eye contact with them. And even if you show them just these simple arrangement of shapes, so you've got A on the left and B on the right, and which one looks like a face to you? And most people are going to say B, right? And sure enough, with a newborn, even in the first week of life, they're going to look longer at B. They're going to preferentially look at the one that even just barely resembles a face. Next slide. And it's why we might see faces in things, like our neighbor's recycling can across the street. So our brains are just cued into anything that might be a social connection, might have information in that face. We're just looking for it. It's sort of how our brains are wired. Next. And so in a really real way, again, down to the cells in our brain, the relationships that we build in our early years, they're truly building our brains. And I think that's such a powerful and wonderful message. Next slide, please. So our brain development is occurring over many stages, many years, but there is this really wonderful opportunity in early childhood. So again, we've got biology, of course, but also the experiences that we have, in particular with people that are consistent, trusted adults in our life. So there's this wonderful window in early childhood to build those relationships with people like yourself that make such a huge impact on the architecture of our brain that then can impact us for our life. Next slide. So when we're asking things like, how do we support healthy brain development for children, especially in times like stress, like we've been talking about for these last couple of years, it comes down to how do we support strong relationships? And often then the answer is looking towards the adult. So reducing systemic and persistent stressors for the adults in their lives so that they can be that consistent adult there. So that's a really important thing, especially thinking back over the last couple of years. Next slide. So there's just been an enormous amount of stress in the last few years. And not all stress is equal. This is something you've probably heard some about, but we tend to classify stress in terms of positive, tolerable, or toxic stress. Positive, might be a short-term thing in our bodies. So maybe heart rate and stress hormone increase for a short period of time, perhaps on a first day of school or something like that. Tolerable stress, we tend to refer to something that is serious, perhaps a natural disaster or, death of a grandparent or something like that. So there is it's a serious event, but the temporary stress response is what we see in the body, as opposed to in toxic stress, we see more of a prolonged stress response. And you'll notice in both tolerable and toxic, I've written here the words relationships, because relationships with other people are one of the key things that helps determine kind of which way this stress response is going to be for us in our bodies. Next slide, please. And this kind of magic here of how our brains work and how this early brain development happens is that relationships end up acting as a buffer to these more serious impacts of stress. So you may have families in pretty rough conditions, and yet we don't see the toxic stress impacts on the body of those children if they've got at least one consistent caregiver in their life. So it's this really wonderful buffering effect. And it doesn't have to be a parent. It doesn't have to be a relative. It can be, somebody like yourself who's a volunteer or has a coach or mentorship or teacher type relationship. It can be a neighbor, truly just any consistent adult in their lives. Next slide, please. And what's most important more than time is the connection that you form with this person. Next slide, please. So in summary, you have this enormous power, and I think it's such a wonderful opportunity in early childhood. And it comes down to these relationships. And you really are a brain builder. And I think that's such a wonderful, inspiring, and powerful thing. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to thank you for all that you do and for your time today, and also direct you to a bunch of free resources that we have in case you wanted to learn more about any of the work that we do at iLabs, but there's infographics and learning modules and a bunch of stuff that's all free. So feel free to screenshot that and view at your pleasure. But thank you all.
Thank you so much, Marley. I think we will all be tuning into that website. And thank you for all those visuals you shared. I mean, I've got this visual now of that hefty newborn and the understanding of why we call the hood of the car the nose sometimes. And there are certain brands that might look a little more like a face. And it just, but the most important thing is what you say about meaningful experiences are what lead to that synapse growth and the relationship of early brain development, the importance of relationships in that. And that's what we're celebrating today here with 10 years of Reading Pals. So thank you for sharing this and for the work that you do every day.